Welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring a Living Wage Across Supply Chains, the Business Case for Action, which is hosted by the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, IDH, and the United Nations Global Compact. I'm Meredith Sumter. I'm the CEO of the Council, which is a global community of business leaders taking action for an economy that works for all. We see getting to a living wage as not just the right thing to do, but the right thing for business to do, positioning our companies and investment strategies to deliver long-term value and create a more equitable economy for employees, communities, shareholders, and our planet. It's really wonderful to have you with us today and to be joined by Griet Katart, Head of Labor Rights at UNGC's Think Lab on Living Wage, Honor Johnson, the Senior Innovation Manager for Better Jobs at IDH's Sustainable Trade Initiative, and Anouk Hyland, who is the Global Sustainability Director at Unilever. Thank you so much, Griet, Honor, and Anouk, for being with us today and for sharing your work with the Council. The health of our companies depends upon the health of markets and the business environment in which our companies operate. And at the Council, we believe that our greatest natural resource, both in producing value and in having that value be consumed, is people. How people are empowered to participate in and to contribute to the economy is a material matter for all companies. Over 600 million workers around the world do not earn enough to afford a decent standard of living. This means they're not paid enough for the work that they do to afford the bare basics, including sufficient food, housing, education, healthcare, and other essential needs. As companies, we lose out on not having a fully engaged workforce and a dynamic consumer market as a result. So today we will hear from, again, UNGC's Head of Labor Rights, who will unpack the concept of a living wage and the imperative for business action. We'll also hear from IDH on two tools that IDH has developed for company use, the Living Wage Roadmap and the Living Wage Action Guide, as well as links to both tools are going to be shared in the chat box for your use and exploration as well. We'll next have a moderated discussion with Anouk, who will share Unilever's experience in prioritizing living wage as a business imperative. We will explore the strategy and actions that Unilever is taking within its own operations and hear about the gaps that Unilever is identifying in trying to transform its global supply chains to get to that living wage. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is public and is being recorded for sharing. And then at the end of today's event, we will share the resources that we'll be discussing today, as well as a short survey to get your feedback. So now it is my pleasure to hand over to Griet to share more with you on the work and resources of the UN Global Compact, which companies of all sizes can benefit from. Griet, over to you.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very pleased to share what the Global Compact is doing. So I'm going to share my screen because I prepared some slides that will help us also to walk through the work that we are doing as Global Compact. So let me share my screen here. So I'm Griet Katart, I'm the Head of Labor Rights at the UN Global Compact. So the UN Global Compact is the largest global corporate sustainability initiative. So we have at this moment 20,000 companies that are participating in our initiative globally. We are represented in all countries, so we will have also 70 local networks that are working closely with us at the global level. And these 20,000 companies, when they join the Global Compact, they agree to align their activities, their strategies around 10 principles. So our 10 principles cover human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. Now, the labor principles, they cover the fundamental principles and rights at work. And of course, we help companies to take action and to be aligned with these labor standards. And that's how we also started working around living wage. Living wage is an essential aspect of decent work, and it's also related to so many decent work deficits. What we see is that, for example, child labor, forced labor, also occupational safety and health risks are often related to low wages. So that is also the reason why we started working around living wage, and why we also want companies to take action on wages to increase the lowest wages in their business operations, but also in their supply chains. So before we start, so why is it so important to focus on low wages? What we see is that inequalities and working poverty are increasing, and Meredith, you already mentioned it. What we see is that 1/3 of the workers globally are estimated to earn less than what we see as a living wage. It's also something that is growing. Social inequality is growing for more than 70% of the global population. We have the climate crisis, but we also see a social inequality crisis. So that also needs the attention of business. When we look at the living wage, we see that 1/3 is earning not enough to help their families to be out of poverty. But when we see at minimum wages, and I will get back to that a bit later, what the difference is between minimum wage levels and living wage levels. But what we see is that also 20% of all the wage earners are earning less than what a legal minimum wage is. So even companies are not really being compliant with what the law is asking to pay for workers. Now, there is also a clear disconnect between productivity and wages. So what we see is that the labor share has been in decline for 3 decades already. And this is a global phenomenon. It's not only in developing countries, we see that everywhere. For example, if you look in the US, we see that more than 40% of the US workers earn less than $15 per hour. And the $15 an hour are really, even in many regions in the US, not a living wage level. Now, businesses, they have a key role to play and they have a responsibility to take. If you look, for example, a lot of companies are doing due diligence, are checking what the risks are in their value chain. And we think that low wages should be part of that exercise. You really should see at what the risks are, and low wages are a risk for companies in how they pay workers in their value chain. Now, we talk about living wage, but why do we not refer to minimum wages? Because there is a clear difference between minimum wage levels and living wage levels. A living wage, and Meredith, you already mentioned it, it's the benchmark income level that allows people to enjoy a decent standard of living. And this is stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So a living wage is a human right. Now, minimum wage levels, that's in principle establishes a wage floor for all workers. So that's really the minimum, the legal floor is what workers should make. And in more than 170 countries, we see that they have minimum wage levels set. So there is a legislation that is saying what a minimum wage should be. And this is agreed often by collective bargaining agreements. It's through a social dialogue process that these levels are set. But what we see is that these legally set minimum wages often fail to meet workers' needs. So they're not high enough to allow workers to be out of poverty. Why is this? First of all, it's often because it's not, they fall below the human rights standards. So it's not high enough. Often because they're not enforced enough, they're not often revised, and they're also not applicable to all workers. And for example, now with rising inflation, we see also the cost of living is increasing, and the minimum wage levels are not catching up to these rising cost of living. So they're not high enough, and that's why we see that companies really have an important role to play to look into living wage levels. These benchmarks exist. There are a lot of data available on what a living wage should be, what the estimates are per region. So the data is available. Companies can take action, but of course, it's not only the responsibility of companies. There is also a role for governments. And that's also why, and as Global Compact, we really like to underline this, is that companies also have a policy advocacy role to play towards governments, because in the end, of course, we want that minimum wage levels, which are set by law, that they reflect living wage levels. Now, very quickly, because I know that also Honor from IDH will speak a bit more on that, but there is a case for action. First of all, like I already mentioned, a living wage is a human right. So there is a corporate responsibility for companies to take action around it. And this is also set in the UN Guiding Principles. Like I said, it should be part of the due diligence process that companies are implementing. But there is also a business case. And I listed here a couple of examples. There is lower staff turnover. If you increase the lowest wages, you have a more productive and more motivated workforce. There's also signs that productivity will increase and it will have an impact on profit. But it's also for your value chain, it will also strengthen your supply chain. There will be a more resilient supply chain if you also invest in higher wages. And also the third reason to take action around this is, of course, also the growing regulation and also the investor interest. There's a lot of pressure to take action from companies. Companies should not wait to start looking into wage levels, into your own business operations, but also into your supply chain. Now we see that a growing number of leading companies are taking action. They make also public commitments around it. For example, also we have the UK Living Wage Foundation, for example. That's an accreditation organization. They have already more than 13,000 certified living wage employers. But what we also see is that not only 4% of the companies have targets or they claim to pay a living wage. So this is really still very low. And if you look into the commitments that companies make, we also see that it is often targeted to specific commodities, to specific geographies. So there's still a lot of room for improvement also for the companies that have set targets. Now, there are also, of course, serious barriers around this. And I think that's why it's so needed that we collaborate, that we work together, that all stakeholders take up their responsibility, but we also have these multi-stakeholder initiatives to work around living wage. There is still the pressure to maximize profit. And I think if actions are taken on living wage in supply chains, it will have an impact on purchasing practices. It will have an impact on price setting. So that's also something that we have to recognize. So there is, of course, an impact on the way that you do business. And of course, also for the workers in your supply chain, you don't have direct control over them. So you will have to work with your suppliers to set up joint action plans to really make an impact on the lowest wages in your supply chain. And then also another barrier is still the benchmarks. There are a lot of different benchmarks available. As Global Compact, we always encourage companies to really work with one benchmark as a start, but in the end, it's about a social dialogue process. You have to engage with workers about the level that reflects a living wage. It's the workers themselves who should have a say in what really entails a living wage. Now, because we saw that there is still so much needed for companies to make the commitment to take action, that is also the reason why we have launched in September the Forward Faster initiative as Global Compact. This is an initiative that we have launched together with other partner organizations working together on specific topics. We have 5 issue areas where we are working on, and living wage is one of them. And in this initiative, we really want companies to make a public commitment around these topics. And on living wage, we have set 2 targets. One target is really focusing on the own employees, so being a living wage employer. And the second target is really is regarding the action plans that you can set up with key stakeholders to impact wages in your supply chain. So we have already now 45 companies that have set targets on living wage. They made this public commitment, but of course we want many more companies to join. It's just very recently launched, but we will have this initiative until 2030. We have a lot of programmatic work around it. Peer learning sessions, academy sessions, trainings, discussions with governments, also with the UN, of course, because the ILO has a very important role to play here, because in the end, they bring together all the constituents, the governments, the employers, and the unions to discuss minimum wage levels. So that is where we really try to have an impact and to work together with all the partners. And I've listed here the partners that have already signed up officially to support the living wage targets of the Forward Faster. So we will work together on this initiative to help companies to set these commitments and to really also take action. And companies will also report back on what exactly they're doing to make progress on these topics. So I'll leave it here. I think there is at the end also some time to take questions on this call to action, but I'm very happy to hand it over now to also Honor from IDH. And as you see, IDH is also a co-partner in this initiative. So Honor, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Thanks, great. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, especially Meredith and the Council, for bringing us together. We're really happy to be part of this great webinar today and share with everyone the tools and the learnings and the experience that we've had. As you can see, many of us are collaborating already, so it's great to share that and expand our work, extend the work on this great topic. Before I begin, I wanted to share briefly a bit about IDH for those of you who are not familiar with us. IDH is a mission-driven organization based in the Netherlands with local representation and teams in 23 countries around the world. We work on several SDGs advancing the sustainability mission through global supply chains. We work with several private sector partners across many commodities, landscapes, and countries, and we have three main impact themes. That's better jobs, better income, and better environment. So today I'm talking a little bit more about better jobs in our roadmap on living wages. So again, what I'm here to introduce to you are three main things: the topic of living wages, where it comes from, and maybe demystify some of the original concept. Then, as Meredith mentioned, I would love to share with you our roadmap on living wages, which is a 5-step guidance full of tools that everyone can use in the supply chain to help take action on this really important topic. And finally, I'll share our Living Wage Action Guide, a tool that you can use with your supply chain partners and everyone working on this topic to really understand and work together on closing living wage gaps. So to start, where did this topic come from? I think Geert gave us a great background and reminder that living wage is a human right. It's founded and very fundamental in the founding language of the ILO in 1919. So it's not a new concept by any means. But we saw a lot of companies trying to work with this topic and embrace the fact that many workers in their supply chain in their own operations needed to be paid a fair living wage, enough to afford a decent standard of living. But progress on this topic really took off following the publication of a uniform methodology around living wages. So understanding exactly how a benchmark, locally specific but globally uniform, could be defined. That was in 2011 with the publication of the Anchor and Anchor methodology. Since then, as Geert also mentioned, there are many, many benchmarks available following very compatible methodologies, and more companies have started to take up this topic, and great work. So the definition, just to bring that forward for those of you who may be new to the topic: living wage, what is it? We're talking about remuneration. So what is received by a worker in a standard amount of time, in a particular place, so region specific, that is sufficient to afford a decent standard of living. So again, this is a very basic, decent concept, and especially includes a decent standard of living for the worker and his or her family. When we want to know what's in that definition, what are we talking about when we talk about decent standard of living? Elements include food, water, healthcare, education, housing, transportation, clothing, and other essential needs. But again, very basic concept. And I'll tell a little bit more about benchmarks in a minute. But remember, this is very region specific. So making sure that the cost of living in a local region is exactly what we're considered. Why work on living wage? Geert already mentioned some amazing facts. Companies are really seeing that an increase in productivity, more resilient supply chains is so critical. What's also really an additional factor to consider about working on living wages is it's incremental and instrumental in working on so many of the SDGs. I think Geert also mentioned child labor, gender equality, better work in so many other capacities. Living wages are at the heart of so many of these topics, and working on living wages can really help in many other areas and help companies achieve their goals and movement towards the SDGs. Additionally, to bring some numbers as well, we see not only does working on living wages support achieving SDGs, but it's also helpful in improving reputation and increased recognition for brands. And I think Unilever can speak to that in a bit. We saw, as was mentioned already, that the UK Living Wage Foundation, which has certified several companies, is showing that those companies who get certified are able to differentiate themselves in the market, really making them more attractive as not only an employer, but a supply chain partner. When we talk about improved productivity and reduced turnover, we have a Harvard Business Review study looking at Costco's wage improvement plan, which significantly reduced turnover and increased productivity. So there's a lot of data out there. We can go into deep dives about case studies and numbers, but overall, this has an infinite growth effect on how we can improve global supply chains. And as Meredith said, and as the Council is here for, really increase the fairness in the supply chain for us all. So IDH, what have we been doing on living wages? Our journey started on living wages about 12 years ago with the creation and the launch of the Floriculture Sustainability Initiative. We had a very large initiative on living wages in Malawi 2020, which started in 2014. And since then, we've had several projects pick up the topic on living wages and try to work with their supply chain partners to improve wages and make sure workers are living a safer and healthier life. In 2019, we also saw a Dutch retail commitment get launched. So that was also a commitment supported by IDH, where we brought together the Dutch retailers here in the Netherlands to make a commitment towards closing living wage gaps. That shortly came before the launch of the roadmap to living wages, which is what I'll get into in a second, really giving those partners and everyone that's been working on living wages tools, making this accessible, breaking it down step by step so that everyone can do things like access credible benchmarks, know where they're at for paying wages currently, et cetera. So what's great about having all of those tools is we saw that following the Dutch retail commitment, several other countries followed suit and were able to have their country-specific banana living wage commitments as well. And now together we're seeing that collaboration grow and really have a uniform approach towards closing living wage gaps, and especially where the supply chains are overlapping. So again, we've helped trying to bring this dialogue forward through several summits, and also creating tools like the salary matrix, the sustainable procurement kit, and the living wage action guide, which we'll also share briefly. But it's not only about tools, and it's not only about measuring, but also making sure we're partnering with agencies like the UN Global Compact, Unilever, the Council, to really make sure we're telling the same story, we're learning from each other and making sure we're moving forward and sharing the difficult parts, because of course this is not always easy work, but it's very important. So the roadmap on living wages, as you can probably imagine, that more than 10 years of experience really brought up a lot of questions. Companies wanted to know many of the doubts that probably maybe some of our attendees have. So what are the benchmarks? How do I find them? How do I know they are credible? And that's the questions that the IDH roadmap on living wages set out to answer. So around those questions, we created a pathway which looks like this. You can find more online about the tools that are available under each step. But it's a step-by-step approach that tries to break down a very big topic and make sure that step one, getting the benchmark, understanding what's the end goal. 2, measuring the living wage gap, understanding where current wages are now. 3, making sure data is credible and audited if necessary. 4, closing living wage gaps. That's where our action guide comes in, and sharing learnings and learning from others that have done great work. We don't do this alone. We have to give a lot of props to our partners who have supported us. You see here the 3 groups that make up our governance group. We have a technical advisory group, a steering committee, and a stakeholder group, which makes sure that we're all working together and aligned and really learning from everybody. And of course, you can see that Unilever and UN Global Compact are part of that. So many collaborations there. So to go to the first part of the roadmap, how do we know what a living wage benchmark is? What are we really looking at? We know this is a measure of decency, but what is really included? And what's the difference between decency and having the benchmark? So just to give you an idea, these are the topics that the Anchor and Anchor methodology has put forward as being included in a benchmark. So these are food, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, and essential needs for a family. So making sure that a family can afford a basic standard of living. But of course, this entire cost of supporting a family should be proportionally divided by the number of wage earners. So making sure that the wage that the earner is earning is sufficient to afford that decent standard of living, which of course means accounting for taxes and other statutory deductions, which are specific to that region. And that's where we get our living wage benchmarks. But of course, this is a hypothetical formula, which the anchors kind of gave us some guidance to do this very specifically. And you've seen many methodologies then take on that approach and provide actual numbers very specific to the region that you're looking at, that maybe you're either producing in or sourcing from. We've built a tool called the Benchmark Finder, which you can check out on our website under the Living Wage Roadmap. This tool can help you find which benchmark methodologies have created a benchmark for the region that you're interested in. So you can type in any country. Here you see Costa Rica has been entered, and you see the many different methodologies that have created benchmarks for that region. So here you see wage indicator and the anchor methodology there in blue. Only benchmark methodologies that are credible and meet a standard set of criteria have been included in the tool. So that way, you know, you can have trust in the credibility of the benchmark. So again, once you have your benchmark, you can move on to step 2, measuring how far current wages are from a particular benchmark. And that's where we're looking at comparable current remuneration. So remuneration amounts, how much workers are earning that compares with the benchmark. We also have a tool for that you can learn more about on our website, just to give you a sample of the results that you could see by filling out this tool or by having a producer fill out this tool. You'd see something like this, so a diagram showing how many workers are not earning the living wage and how far away from the living wage benchmark they are. Again, I'm happy to share the links, and I think the team can post them in the chat for people who want to know a little bit more about the details. But again, measuring is just the beginning. So you have your benchmark, you have your wage measurement to see how far away you or your supply chain are from the living wage gap. And that data can be valuable for doing so much, right? So we can see companies approach verification, approach auditing, approach standards. There's many different uses for the data that's being gathered, but especially it can be used to inform action. So knowing whether your gaps are 1% here and there or much larger in certain sourcing regions is very important to decide how you want to work with your supply chain or in your own operations to close those gaps. And that's where we have the tool that I wanted to share with you today, which we can share a link, called the Living Wage Action Guide. This is a dynamic tool, and I think Meredith, you can, if you nod, you can see the tool live, right? So this is a link that's going to be shared with everyone as well. Thanks. I think you can see it. And here you can see a little bit more. You can dive in with your supply chain partners and see how different actors, different impact areas, and different challenges are linked to which interventions. So maybe you can explore here many of the things that have been mentioned already. They also mentioned procurement practices, a critical part of also working on this topic, improving social dialogue in a facility location or in your own operations, a critical foundational piece to working on living wages. So I invite you also to explore this tool. You'll see that all of the interventions have detailed pages and tips that have been collected through the community and our years of experience working on this, as well as the experience of many others. You also find case studies in here. For example, if I click on social dialogue and we visit the social dialogue page, you can see a lot of tips, but I'll scroll right to the case studies to give you the idea. So here you could see all the case studies that relate to increasing this intervention page towards living wages. So I know it's a brief insight to a very big tool, but do take a look if you have time after the webinar. And with that, I think I'll just move to the final wrap up of the roadmap. So again, lots of tools available. As Griet said, a lot has been explored. There's a lot out there. We can learn so much from what has happened before, and we can't do it alone. And I think Unilever is definitely able to speak on that topic. So yeah, do reach out, collaborate with us and everyone here, and let us know how we can further support you on the living wage journey, getting started or sharing our tools. So with that, happy to hand it over to Anouk Helene from Unilever, who's the Global Sustainability Director. I think she's here to share some of the great work that they've been doing on this topic and with her own operations and supply chains. Anouk, thanks, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Lana. And I think you just made it super practical and kind of really helpful for companies to operationalize this very important agenda. I have 2 slides, and Libby will share them. Libby, kindly, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So I guess Meredith, Griet, and Honoré all included like similar messages, which is essentially about the why of this agenda, and that is because from experience within Unilever, this agenda also starts with the why. So you don't get your senior buy-in in your companies if you cannot really explain the why to your company. And that needs to be on various levels, right? So for Unilever, we say that we are a sustainability run and led business. And if we claim that, we can simply not rely on poverty wages in the supply chain, because that would mean that we would accept that people in our supply chain don't earn enough to get by on a daily basis. And that's the agenda that we really talk about. So in my experience working at Unilever, it's good to humanize the agenda, right? Because otherwise you kind of land on corporate speech, whilst we're talking about people here and people who depend on our companies for making a living. And then obviously the business case there is super important in terms of making a compelling case internally. What we've done at Unilever is, thank you for sharing the link, Melissa, is we've invested in a paper which lays out very clearly the commercial benefits, so the business benefits. It's led by Business Fights Poverty in collaboration with Harvard University and with Shift. And I would really recommend to kind of read it, because there are some compelling proof points that will help you land this agenda inside your companies. And then obviously the macroeconomic case, last year, the Business Commission to Tackle Inequality published a report in which they have evidence that it would boost global GDP by a tremendous 4.5 trillion every year if this agenda would be adopted globally. And Griet also already spoke about some regulatory and external pressure, which for a company like Unilever, we are sensitive to that. If I get the news that one of our competitors is ranking, is doing it better in terms of rankings, you know, that's what people inside the business are sensitive to. So that's something, and we know that also from a regulatory perspective, there will be some guidelines and regulations coming our way. For example, the EU corporate sustainability due diligence that will be applicable to Unilever as well in future. So next slide, please. So I've been asked to share a little bit about Unilever and our commitments. And that's the first lesson that I also, or the second one that I wanted to share today, is that this starts with getting the own operations in order. So for Unilever, we started this in 2014. And when we launched the framework for fair compensation, in which we talk about fair living wage for the own workforce. So Unilever's own workers, about 130,000 globally. And we started to close the gap like every year. And it took us 6 years to become living wage compliant, which we actually achieved in 2020. And we were accredited by the Fair Wage Network as a living wage compliant company. Now in 2021, we launched the next iteration of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which is called the Compass. And the Compass is our current business strategy, and that includes sustainability targets as well. And we wanted to share transformational targets that would really, really have an impact on people and planet. And we decided to take living wage and massively roll that out in the supply chain. So we published a commitment to ensure that everyone who directly provides goods and services to Unilever earns a living wage or income by 2030. And in the long version of the commitment, we actually state that we want to focus on those who are most vulnerable in our supply chain. And in our case, that's those working in manufacturing or in agriculture. So if you look at how we implement that day to day, and I think Honoré already shared the IDH roadmap with the 5 stages that are massively helpful. But from our perspective, we cannot do everything at once. It's not doable, it's not focused, and it's not an efficient way of going about it. So what we've done, we have a portfolio prioritization whereby we have a phased approach and we focus on those nearest to the own operations. So in that means for us collective manufacturing. So those working in factories that are actually supplying Unilever directly, contingent workforce, so those who are paid by external labor agencies, but again, working side by side on a daily basis with Unilever employees as well. And we roll that out in a phased approach in terms of our procurement strategy. But then simultaneously, we know that this can actually put us at a competitive disadvantage if we do this, and if Unilever is the only company actually asking this in the supply chain, which is why we think it's super important to create a level playing field through a dedicated advocacy program. And we have 4 pillars there. So one is to help accelerate other companies' commitments. So that is what we're doing here today, to share some of our learnings. But that's also by gathering companies at the World Economic Forum, actively participating with GRIT and with the UN Global Compact, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, obviously Inclusive Capital. Today, I mean, it's wonderful that you are focusing more and more on this agenda, because, by the way, particularly amongst US companies, we hope to see greater uptake of commitments. The other thing that we focus on in terms of advocacy is demonstrate the business imperative, whereby in my experience, it's super important to really, really highlight the commercial benefits to the company. So we're doing various impact studies to demonstrate that. Then the next one is about creating an enabling infrastructure and environment by providing access to data and tools. Now, GRIT already referred to it, but there are numerous benchmarks available out there. Their information is currently behind a paywall. So there's lack of transparency, lack of credibility, and lack of scalability of the agenda, which is why we are partnering with a group of companies to help fund the publication of the data and tools. And then finally, make sure that we also work on this agenda at a country level to raise minimum wages towards living wages. And that means that we have prioritized about like 6 to 7 countries where the gap between minimum wage and living wage is big, and where we have leverage through Unilever spend because of the size of our spend in that specific country. And that's where we work together with the procurement team on dedicated advocacy, building local coalitions, understanding the landscape, what is the government position, and how can we actually engage in a dialogue with those governments. So this is kind of a nutshell in terms of, or in a nutshell, what we focus on in terms of our, of how we actually do this as a company. And Honoré, back to you.
Thanks, Anouk. This is great and really always interesting to hear how your work has evolved and how a lot of the important pieces are breaking these up into bite-sized pieces, right? And starting where you can and expanding the work. I'm really curious to know what's been the biggest challenge or barrier into really implementing your agenda, and how has that gone? What can you share with us on the webinar today?
So many of the challenges have already been mentioned, right? So the data one is a challenge. The lack of awareness and alignment on what constitutes a living wage. So we have done 2 baseline assessments amongst our suppliers, and both came back inconclusive. Because if we look at the explanation behind what is filled in, they often refer to minimum wage rather than living wage. So that means that there's a lack of understanding in terms of what the agenda entails. It's seen as a cost to the business rather than an opportunity for investment in something that the business would actually benefit from, which is why we are investing a lot in making sure that we move the narrative from something that is purely an on-cost to the business to something that is much more, that will benefit the business in the long run. So that is the one barrier that we see, and we hope to see an accelerated movement And what I mean by that is the lack of other companies' commitments in this space. We're seeing more and more movement, but like obviously not fast enough. So we hope that that will speed up in the next years or so.
Thanks for sharing. Another question, I'm curious, because you also mentioned a lot about the business case and the benefits for companies taking on this work. Is there any one example that you find really useful to get other companies excited about this work, either in the supply chain or companies looking at their own operations as far as benefits for business, productivity, or retention?
Yes, there are various studies out there that actually demonstrate this with actual numbers. And I'm happy to share some of those links as well. For Unilever as a consumer goods company, the most compelling one is the one that it grows consumer markets for us in the short term. So when people actually earn more, they will spend more in the supermarket, and that's where they buy our products. That was one of the main arguments that we shared internally to our with our leadership in terms of the reason why, from a business perspective, this was a good kind of agenda to invest in.
Thanks, Anouk. That's great. I think to leave some time for questions more broadly from the audience, I'll also hand it back to Meredith, if that's all right. Over to you.
Thank you, Honor.
Thanks, Anouk.
Yes, of course. This is Meredith. I'm so sorry. My video is not able to work. I wonder if the host of the Zoom, if you could enable. Thank you very much. All right, here we go. Great. All right. So it's wonderful to see you, Anouk and Honor. Great. If I could also ask you to come on video so our audience can join us. All right. So if you have questions for our guests, please put them straight into the chat box and we'll take them from there. But while we're waiting for those questions, what I'd like to do is just jump into the last point, Anouk, that you were making on the business case. And in this, Honor, we get this question all the time at the council. I would say, actually, and this is exciting for us, just over the last year, we have noticed a considerable uptake in company interest on living wage, precisely because they are seeing the historic rising levels of inequality globally. And they're seeing what that means in terms of translating into the health of the marketplace in which they operate. But in many cases, it's easier for companies to start first on, and they're trying to demonstrate the material value to their companies on how does paying that increased wage help our operations, our productivity, our value creation. One of the council members who's not here today, but who had done early work on this in the US market is PayPal. And Dan Schulman, who was CEO at the time, the company was doing very well profitably, and it had come to his attention inadvertently that a good portion of his entry-level workers were not able to afford just to have one job to make ends meet. In other words, they had to work for PayPal and someone else to be able to pay the bills at the end of the month. And he just thought that was absolutely not the kind of company that he wanted to run and how he wanted to take care of his workforce. So he started first in working with Just Capital, also a council ally. They started a financial wellness initiative. And what they found actually was that when you're taking care of your people, what they found, similar to what our colleagues here are sharing, employee engagement, lower turnover, higher satisfaction among their customers who are interacting with their employees as well. And the company just continued to prosper and grow along the way. Now, the data question that we have here, we're at this very exciting early stage of companies realizing that social issues and living wage in particular, how we compensate our employees, that this is a material issue for the health of their marketplace, but also for how they're able to produce value now and over the long term. But it's the case studies that IDH and UNGC makes available. It's the example that Unilever and PayPal, Bank of America, and others are coming forth that say, when we take care of our people, we produce greater value, and we have stronger and more resilient value chains in the process. In absence of, at this early stage in time, the more companies are able to do this work and to share out what they're doing, recognizing that we all don't have the right answers, and that's okay. But as companies, we've got the ingenuity to know that we've got to try somewhere, and that's why we think just the work that UNGC and IDH are doing in creating sort of communities of practice of companies who are trying things out, sharing what's working, sharing what's not, adjusting their approach, trying again, progressing our action. This is how businesses and markets work. And this is a natural thing for all of us to do. And it's just a very exciting time, a huge untapped value resource for our companies and our investors who are recognizing the systemic risks of inequality too. This is an exciting time for companies to begin to get started. So sorry for that soapbox, but listening to you three, as well as the incredible tools, the Forward Faster work, as well as the tools and roadmaps that are made available through IDH. I'm just looking at the challenges and the examples of interventions on the Living Wage Guide. Very exciting and a ripe opportunity for all of us to learn and improve our practices, and to see not only the value that we create, but just the more engaged, dynamic workforce that we get to create with too. So with that, I wanted to start with grit and honor. For those companies that are here and that recognize we need to do something, but we don't quite know where to start. We've got a roadmap, we've got tools and resources for them to explore. But when you're working with companies, and I'd love for you to answer it both in terms of large companies and then also smaller companies, what are typical first actions or benchmarks, goals that they start with?
Yeah, Onur, I'm happy to start, and I will hand it over to you, because you have I think as Global Compact, what we see is that we always tell companies that just start, don't wait for, and that was something that we heard in a recent session, that is, start, don't wait for the perfection, action is better than perfection. And I think that really summarized it well, is that none of the companies is there yet in their value chain. It's really, it will take time. And Anouk already mentioned that it took their Unilever also time to even make sure that all their own employees are paid a living wage. And then you start working in specific geographies, with specific commodities, for example, to really understand what the issues are. And I think as Global Compact, we had the question also, where should we start? Because it's so big and we don't know how to take action. That's the reason why we also developed an analysis tool, a living wage analysis tool, which is a bit the step 0 to explain really what we are talking about, what exists, what benchmarks exist, which partners are working around it, where you can find also organizations in the different countries that can help you to take action. So that's really the first step, I think. So I would really encourage companies to take that analysis tool, and that tool will also guide you towards other guidance, other tools, for example, the salary matrix of IDH, the roadmap of IDH. So it will also guide you towards these other tools. So that would be my advice. Take the analysis tool first to understand where you are, what the issues are, and where you can take action. And then I'm happy to also hand it over to Honor, who can speak then on the next step. So when you have an understanding where you want to work and what actions you can take, then there is a guidance from IDH.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Exactly. Having a first analysis, using the tools that are available to get a big picture of your supply chain, and starting to also engage with either, if it's a large company, or your whole supply chain, or even in your own operations, just engaging with the stakeholders that need to be informed. And as Anouk, I think, gave the great example of really knowledgeable about the actual topic and understand what it means, the living wage, I think is critical for that first step 0. And then moving into step 1, getting familiar with the data to really understand how big is the problem that we're looking at can be a very helpful kind of first step. So we see very different interventions needed when we're talking about gaps that are significantly large. Whereas when we have gaps that are a bit smaller, maybe we can close this on our own. Whereas in the cases that it's bigger, really involving local governments, unions, and supporting partners to help us really change an economy and move towards a living wage economy is needed. So, but really understanding the size of the problem before we start to tackle it, although not getting too caught up in having the perfect data, but having some information before we try to tackle and get our hands dirty is really useful. But I think that comes through also through the work of Unilever and many of the partners that we've seen. So engaging stakeholders, getting an understanding of where we're at, really understanding the topic, and slowly understanding the size of the issue that we're working with. That would be the
That's so terrific, and I think that the we're here as a private sector, largely private sector member association, but a lot of the most important work that we do is in engagement with the public sector, and I think that your points about getting to an enabling environment, sharing what works, and then also engaging with public sector partners and government on what is needed for that enabling environment with that shared goal of sharing more broad-based prosperity. So that the next question we have from our audience is for Anouk. Anouk, how do you adapt to the evolving landscape where market changes can suddenly alter living wages? For example, if economic distress shifts supplier regions and drives up the cost of essential goods and services, what adjustments would you make? So that's the first part of a two-part question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So the commitment that we've made is a 10-year commitment because we know these shocks happen, right? So as such, we know that the risk will be mitigated over time. We just touched upon the collaboration with governments because so if you look at Unilever's full strategy, the commitment as such is about living wage on living income. But the actual vision is about raising living standards. And that is not only being done by paying a living wage. So first of all, we need to put living wage in a wider agenda about decent work. And to increase living standards, it's not only a company's job to actually pay a certain wage or provide a certain income. There's a government job to put in place policy interventions that reduce the cost of living. It's also about them providing access to education, healthcare. So it's not something, I don't think you can see living wage in isolation. It should be done in a wider package where everybody contributes to essentially increase the living standards. McKinsey at the moment is doing super interesting research as to how you can actually increase living standards. They talk about the notion of a empowerment threshold, and they've chosen that because living wage is part of that. But there's a series of interventions and actions that can be taken by various actors that would actually help to come in a spin of empowerment and of living standards.
And a terrific response, Anouk, and as always, concrete with substance from Unilever on the work that you're doing. And the second part of the question that the audience member had was climate change likely to add even more pressure on our value chain and sustainability, but also impacts on people. And how might a company think about incorporating climate impacts as they are trying to figure out how do we get to a living wage for a given market?
So at Unilever, we have very specific targets about climate change. And obviously, we know that we cannot address climate change if people cannot make ends meet. So That is why we are reviewing policies and practices to make sure that we don't approach these agendas in isolation, but that we actually have combined agendas whereby we actually assess some of the climate work that we do to actually put a social lens on there, and livelihoods and raised living standards is one of the key components that we would test some of our climate work on. I'm not sure if that actually answers the question, but the main point or the main response to this question from my perspective is that we need to take an integrated approach towards climate and social, and that we cannot only do that by, because I feel there's loads of talk about the need for a just transition and about the need for climate justice, but we also need to make that agenda quite actionable for companies, because now I feel it's a very big, all-encompassing agenda. So that's why we've taken certain actions in terms of our policies and practices. So, for example, with the Climate and Nature Fund or the Climate Transition Action Plan that we have, we want to systemically put a social lens on there to make sure that we actually look at these issues together.
Excellent. I know. Thank you so much. And we're coming close to time, but we have two more questions from the audience. I just want to mention them both very quickly, and then ask Anna or Greet or all of our panelists, if they have a view on this, to quickly weigh in. First, for Anna, what kind of checks and verifications are employed on the ground to make sure that companies are reporting progress toward living wage benchmarks accurately, and that the living wage increases are making it to the employees it's intended for? And to Greet, or if others have a view on this, can you speak a little bit about the deployment of emerging technologies and tracking progress towards achieving living wage benchmarks?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. I can start, but I think, as all of us have mentioned, we're really in an innovative stage where companies and groups and initiatives are trying to find the best way forward to do this really at scale. So we're also here learning and sharing learnings as we go. One of the solutions that IDH is helping offer is a living wage assessment, where we can support you rolling out the salary matrix tool in your supply chain, verifying that through our list of trained auditors who are available to use the tool, and really tracking that progress at a very detailed level over time. That's also in partnership with our trained auditor program, which is, again, still building, and always happy to take questions on that. I think many companies are still in early stages of exploring, what does this really mean? How can we engage those stakeholders? But when companies are coming around to making strong and credible claims that shows that value is moving to the pockets of the workers, which is, of course, the end goal of all of us, that's where those trained auditors and verification of data are really, really going to come in. So that's one of the pieces of the tools that's really growing. I think the salary matrix at the moment has over 2,500 producers who have used and submitted wage assessments through that tool, which is available online for anyone to check out. But also happy to share if anyone else has great tools and initiatives for, really the emerging technologies and tracking progress. I think also the work of Faster Forward, of really showcasing companies' commitments publicly, is really valuable in this, to show what's happening and that we're not alone. So maybe, Greet, you can also share more on this.
Yeah, I just would like to say that, especially on the Forward Faster, we just launched it, so there will be a lot of more information coming up, also on case examples for SMEs, because of course that's a bit different than for multinationals. And I also would like to to flag that when we work around living wage, we often engage with different people in companies. So if we talk about living wage for own employees, we engage with human resource departments. But when we talk then about supply chain, and then we involve the buying departments, the sustainability, the human rights people. So it's really a topic that really brings together companies from different departments in a company. And I think that is also so important, that you need that CEO engagement, of course, to work around it, but then you also have to engage with different departments. And that is also on the technology. I think this is very relevant for HR colleagues that are really looking into the systems in your own operations. But as soon as you talk about supply chain, there is also it's also the blockchain technology, of course, that also comes into place, but it's also about you do your buying.
No, for sure. And it's an exciting and an innovative and a learning and a trying time. And all that, we encourage all of you who are listening on this call, think about what you and your company can do and where you can get started. And with that, I want to say thank you so much again to Grit, to Honor, and Anouk for sharing your time and expertise on this critical business issue, material business issue of getting to a living wage. And thanks to all of you for joining today's webinar. If you'd like to have more information on UNGC's Forward Faster Living Wage Work and IDH's Roadmap on Living Wages and Living Wage Action Guide, please reach us at the address that will be shared in the chat box, programs@inclusivecapitalism.com, and we will put you in touch with our colleagues here to get you going. If you're interested in joining the council to share out the concrete commitments that you are taking, that your company is making toward ensuring a living wage across your company, or even across your value chains, or commitments in other inclusive capitalism areas, please also reach us at programs@inclusivecapitalism.com as well. And finally, please don't forget to complete the brief survey using the link in our chat box. We want to hear your thoughts about today's events and get your take on ideas for future webinars. So with thanks from all of us at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, Grit Guittard, Honor Johnson, and Anouk Hyland, you take care, and you all keep us posted at the Council on where your business leadership is heading next. Thanks so much.